Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome. Welcome to this new episode of Groundwork Policy Briefing in Action. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Just letting people into the webinar. We have over 350 people registered, so we are just giving a few minutes for people to join us today. Welcome again to this session of Groundwork Policy Briefing for Action. I'm Paula Alvarado from Seeds from Change, and I'll be moderating today. Good morning, good afternoon, welcome everybody. As we let people into the room, please introduce yourself in the chat. We would love to know who are you and where you're calling from. As you probably know, this session is part of Groundwork Policy Briefing of Actions, a collective initiative of Seeds for Change, TINTA, and the International Climate Politics Hub with support from CLUA. Since 2023, this briefing has reached more than 2,000 people working across climate, biodiversity, and energy governance. So welcome today, welcome to this session. As we are just having a look at how many people are coming into the room, so we are actually welcoming everybody and leaving a couple of minutes for the people who are joining slightly late. As you join in today, please introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us who are you, where are you coming from, where are you calling, what part of the world are you? And wherever you are calling from, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Now, just a few practical things before we start. We have live interpretation in English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Indonesian. So if you haven't done yet, please go to the little globe at the bottom of your Zoom screen and click and choose the language that you prefer for interpretation. This session will be in English. Most of the speakers will speak in English. One of them will speak in Spanish. Everybody else will be speaking English, but you can choose the language you would like to listen to this whole session. So just remember to listen in your language, click the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen, the little globe, and choose your channel. If you are using your mobile phone, you will find it under the More menu. And once you have selected your language, remember to mute the original audio so you hear only the interpretation. Otherwise, you're going to have two different languages coming in, and that can be confusing. So let's keep on going. So while we're getting going, let's tell us who is here, who is in the room. Again, open the chat and put your name, your organization, the country you're joining from. And if you want to save the chat, you can do that too. So that is great. It's really good to see. It's really good to see who is in the room. Remember, please, that the questions go in the Q&A box. There is, again, a little box at the bottom of your screen where you can write your questions. Please do not write them in the chat because we will lose them. My colleagues are here to support us, but there is a lot going on during this session. So always ask the questions in the Q&A box. Just to make sure that none of them gets lost. And, send them whenever a thought lands during this session. Do not wait until the end. We will, we will answer as many as possible. We will have the second half of this session for questions, but just put them in the chat. In some cases, the speakers answer them before the webinar gets to its second half. So just don't be shy. Just go ahead and ask the questions, thoughts that you have. Hi everybody. Great to see you here. Just looking at some of you in the chat, and it's fantastic to see that you're so active and engaged already. Okay, so let's start then. Let me set up a little bit where we are. Where are we standing today? So let's start a little bit with the idea of a just transition. A just transition is a concept that moving away from fossil fuels has to be done fairly, and it runs through every part of society: jobs and livelihoods, health, energy access, land and food, and who gains and who loses along the way. It is also where some of the strongest commitments to Indigenous peoples' rights in the climate process today sit. So today we're going to follow one thread to all of that, and it's the thread of transition minerals. As you all know, because you've been following this topic for a while as well, is that the energy transition runs on minerals like cobalt, copper, lithium, nickel. And today we're facing two kind of compounding pressures that are pushing the demand even higher. The transition is a response to climate change, and it has also become a question of energy security and autonomy, sharpened by disruption to global energy supplies. When the COP31 president addressed the bond talks this month, which are still ongoing, by the way, and he pointed to the Strait of Hormuz and argued that wind and sun cannot be sanctioned or blockage. Out of that come two narratives running side by side: renewable energy for climate action and renewable energy for energy autonomy. Both are mineral intensive, and the effect of the two together is to entrench extraction rather than to ease it. The geography of that extraction is very specific. Research published in Nature Sustainability in 2022, just 3 years ago, mapped more than 5,000 energy transition mineral projects worldwide are found in 54, that's more than half, sit on near, so basically 54% sit on or near the lands of Indigenous peoples. So the question is of who decides how these minerals come out of the ground and on what terms falls directly on Indigenous territories and those of Afro-descendant peoples and local communities as well. At COP30 in Belém, after years of advocacy, the Just Transition Program, the track inside the UN climate talks where governments negotiate how to move away from fossil fuels fairly. So the cost does not fall on workers and community, and it's where the rights language we are discussing today was agreed. So we're just looking at the slides now where we're actually reviewing again what a just transition means and how it touches on different areas of society. And when we discuss just transition work, we refer at all these areas of society. But as I said earlier in this introduction, we are going to focus on transition minerals. So what happened at COP30? Well, after years of advocacy, some of the strongest language on Indigenous rights that climate process has ever produced was finally adopted. Paragraph 12.1 recognizes the importance of free, prior, and informed consent in line with the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and affirms the right to self-determination and acknowledges the rights and protections of Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact. The same decision agreed to establish a just transition mechanism to support international cooperation, technical assistance, capacity building, and knowledge sharing. We can go to the next slide, please. Claire, we can go to the next slide. Hello? Okay, well, let's keep on going. I think I don't see the slides, but I hope you do. So, there is Claire, can we go to the next slide? Thank you. And the next one? Thank you. One more. Sorry, it seems I just went too fast and I didn't alert my colleagues when to change the slides. So here is a review for you. You remember 54% of energy transition mineral projects sit on the lands of Indigenous peoples. Claire, can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Yes, that's where we are. And that's my bad, everybody. That's not my colleagues. I just went too fast and didn't give the alerts for the slides change. So here is what we have. One slide back, please, Claire. Can we go back one slide? Claire, one slide back, please. Yes, thank you. Okay, so this is what we were just looking at, right? We know that at COP30, some of the strongest language was agreed. And was also agreed the establishment or the creation of a new just transition mechanism. How that mechanism is going to be operationalized is being discussed today. And how it's going to be operationalized is going to be decided at COP31. So we have a gap. Okay, we have a gap because in this agreement at COP30, there is a gap. And the gap is the references to the transition, to the dimension of transition minerals and the impacts of mineral extraction. Okay, so those two things were taken out of the final test. So the climate process now affirms the rights of the peoples whose lands holds these minerals, while saying almost nothing about destruction reaching those same lands. The UN Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues named that gap directly this year, calling on parties to reflect that FPIC is binding national frameworks by 2027 and including transition minerals. So closing the gap that we just discussed, is a work between now and COP31 in July, at the end of this year. So we have 6 months. The mechanism agreed last year in Belém still has to be operationalized, how it functions, who takes part, how it handles the risk of transition pathways, how do these carry into the territories, all that has to still be to discuss. Those questions are open right now. As I said a few minutes ago, that's exactly what is being discussed at the Bonn climate talks. And now, this is a live opportunity. This is happening now, and this is why we're here today. So each of our 4 speakers carries part of the thread. We have with us Joan Carling. So let me just pause there 1 second and just talk to my team and ask our technical support team if they could please move the slides forward a little bit. So if we can go forward in the slides, please. Yes, again, Claire, if we can go to the speakers, or Lydia.
Yeah, it's already there.
Yes, there we are. Okay, there we are, Joan. Thank you. Okay, so each of our speakers is going to contribute for different perspectives today. We have Joan Carling, who opens international level, what was achieved at COP, how transition minerals and indigenous peoples' rights are being handled in other spaces like the OECD and the UN business and human rights system among them. Then we go to our next speaker, Bryan Bixcul, who is now in Bonn. Next slide, please. And Bryan will take us inside the UNFCCC negotiations room and the question on how the new mechanism can carry the rights forward. From there, we move into 3 territories. We will have Emmanuel, Umpula, and Nkumba, who take us to the Copperbelt in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Carlos Mamani Condori, who take us to the Bolivian Altiplano. And then Joan returns to add detail of what is happening in Asia. And the questions underneath all of them, what we are going to discuss with the 4 of them, is what happens when consent is bypassed, what recourse is there, and after that, we will open the discussions for your questions. So that's the structure of today, and we will have time for your questions. So, Joan, let's begin with you. So we begin with Joan Carling, and we have a couple of questions for you, Joan, maybe to start talking a little bit about your experience and from your long perspective across all these processes. What did Indigenous peoples actually achieve at COP30 through the Just Transition Program? And what does paragraph 12I change in practice once you step outside the negotiating halls?
Yeah, okay. Thanks for having me here, Paula, and also a good day to all the participants to this important conversation. If I can request the team to put the slide on, I just want to read exactly the language on paragraph 12I, and to read, and this has been the result of the collective work of Indigenous peoples through the Indigenous Peoples Caucus at the UNFCCC. So I just want to emphasize that this has been the result of the hard work of collective hard work of Indigenous peoples engaging in the UNFCCC. So if I read it, it says the importance of the rights of indigenous peoples and of obtaining their free, prior, and informed consent in accordance with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the importance of ensuring that all just transition pathways respect and promote the internationally recognized collective and individual rights of indigenous peoples, including the rights to self-determination, and acknowledge the rights and protections for indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact in accordance with relevant international human rights instruments and principles. This paragraph is a milestone, if I may say. I think this is the strongest paragraph referring to indigenous peoples in all the text that has come out in the UNFCCC negotiations so far. And in addition to this, there are also other reference to indigenous peoples. Can you move to the issue of course, the general one on human rights, the right to healthy environment, again, indigenous peoples' rights, land rights, traditional knowledge, and intergenerational equity. These are all part of the COP30 outcomes. That's very, very important for indigenous peoples. Now, as you mentioned, the next slide, you've already mentioned the 54% of transition minerals. Next slide, please. So this is the location. No, in the map, this is the location of the 54%. The yellow is the territories of indigenous peoples. So we can see that with this, it means there's going to be conflicts all over in the different regions, no, of indigenous peoples across the world, because of the plan for mining of these transition minerals. And in addition to this, can you move to the next slide, please? Next slide is the already ongoing environmental and social impacts. The conflicts, for example, that's happening in DRC, Myanmar, and Colombia are also related to the mining of cobalt, nickel, copper, rare earth, and other minerals. 62% located in high water risk areas, and this is particular in the lithium triangle in Latin America. This is Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, and my colleague, I think later will expound on this. And then also in Mexico and Australia, lithium mining is really use a lot of water, and it's a threat actually to water supply. And likewise, the issue of food security is very much also impacted by mining of transition minerals. And this can be seen already largely in Africa, wherein 71% of the ongoing mining activities are in food insecure regions. So with this data alone, it already shows the serious implications of mining of transition minerals. And this is on top of the massive eviction, the loss of livelihoods. Millions will definitely lose their livelihoods, the environmental devastation that it will cause, and also the food insecurity again, and as well as the threat to intergenerational knowledge and intergenerational survival of indigenous peoples. So, this historic, if I may say, historic agreement in COP30 is really critical for indigenous peoples, especially since it really specifically refers to the fundamental rights of indigenous peoples, the land tenure, free, prior, and informed consent, self-determination are critical for us to be able to protect our rights in this in the mining of transition minerals in particular, but also in the overall imposition of the just transition. So if we look at the key actors now that should follow these rules, of course, we have the states. They're the ones who agreed on this, so they're expected to implement it.
Exactly.
We have the corporations, we have investors. And with these organizations, for example, have declared their support, right, to the energy transition, the just transition, and their specific interest on transition minerals. And these organizations, like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, which has a responsible business conduct guideline, the International Financial Institution, or IFC, of the World Bank has already also expressed that they will fund mining of transition minerals. The International Council of Mining and Metals, which is the association of mining companies, and now the Consolidated Mining Standard Initiative, which is again putting together the mining industry basically to have one standard. And while they have standards that align already to the agreement, particularly, for example, on the free, prior, and informed consent, these standards are voluntary. It's not
Okay.
mandatory. So that is the
So,
big
so in
challenge.
practice, exactly. And that's my question, Joanne. So, what does that look like in practice? Because we have
Yes.
those openings at these international spaces, and I know that you are working really hard for those standards to be implemented. But in practice, what does it really look like?
In practice, what we've seen is systemic violations, right? That is
Mm.
still what is prevailing, and that is the one that is concerning us very much. Because, again, like I said, these are being imposed without our free, prior, and informed consent. So, with this additional tool coming from from COP 30, we can demand mandatory implementation. For example, of the free, prior, and informed consent, the conduct of human rights due diligence, which is in their policy, in ensuring also the proper conduct of environmental and social impact studies with the participation of indigenous peoples. And these are all in their policy, but it's not being implemented. And that is also
Mm.
why we see systemic violations like land grabbing and resource grabbing is still happening in the different parts where transition mineral mining is taking place. So what we need now is for states, especially those, to regulate these companies to make sure that they follow what they have committed. And part of that is really to regulate the other actors. It's in the power of states to regulate companies and investors to abide by their human rights obligation, to respect the rights of indigenous peoples, have clear policies to implement free, prior, and informed consent, and to set up grievance mechanisms that are effective. Because that is, again, part of the problem, the challenge that we are facing now. When communities are evicted, they don't have anywhere to go. There is no access to justice, and where their lands are destroyed or polluted, and they lost their livelihoods, there's also nowhere to go. And that is the big issue also in relation to this problem of transition, mining of transition minerals. There are no effective accountability mechanisms when our rights are violated by companies and even states who are pursuing this and disregarding our rights. So, but in any case, we need to, that means we need to make communities, especially those in sitting or who have transition minerals in their territories, to be aware of their rights, and that they need to, like, the rights especially over their lands and territories,
Mm.
and that they can develop their protocol on how free, prior, and informed consent should be done in relation to them, so that they can engage with companies and the governments in ensuring the respect for their rights and their well-being. So these are some of the steps that we can do. One is to make sure that communities are aware of their rights and that they consolidate, they strengthen their indigenous institutions and their organizations and develop their free, prior, and informed consent protocols to guide their engagement in order that they can protect their rights, and use that as a leverage, right? To say that governments not only consult, but also should get their consent before any mining activity can take place. What's happening now is that the consultation process only happens when permits are already issued to mining companies, and thereby the prior has not been honored, right? That it should be even before exploration can take place, sharing of information, objective information, including diverse impacts of mining, should be already shared to communities. So these are some of
Thank
the
you.
things that we can now, communities can now use, that based on the agreement that any companies involving in the just transition need to respect their rights and need to get their consent.
Thank you, Joan, for that. We're going to circle back to you to talk about what is happening in Asia, in aligned with what you just described, the lack of respect for those processes. Let's move from the international space, for the international picture, to talk a little bit about what is happening right now. Bryan Bixcul was in the room when this agreement was reached at COP, and now he is in Bonn as well, discussing what this mechanism should look like. So let's go to Bryan now and see what is happening in Bonn, and he can update us a little bit. Maybe Bryan, welcome today. It's a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for escaping the Bonn negotiations rooms to be here with us today. You have described two compounding pressures on the transition right now: renewable energy for climate action and renewable energy for energy autonomy. Both, as we all know here, are mineral intensive. Both are entrenching the extraction of indigenous lands. So let's start here. How did that pressure show up inside the COP30 negotiations? And how did the transition minerals language end up out of the final text? It will really help the audience, I think, to understand that these negotiations run on consensus. So a single government pushing back can be enough sometimes to keep the language out. So maybe start us there.
Yes. Maltiosh Chave Paula, Maltiosh Chave Kachalach, Nia Hunitsilawach. That's a greeting in my indigenous language. I belong to the Maya Tsutuhil people from Guatemala and serve as the global coordinator for the Search Coalition. We are a platform to support indigenous people's self-determination and the urgent need for implementing the right to free, prior, and informed consent in the global energy transition. So thank you so much for the question. And as you said, I'm coming to you from Bonn, where we are discussing the implementation or the operationalization of the just transition mechanism. And so I would like to address your first question, because, of course, we've seen the narrative from coming out of parties and, of course, the industry about why deploying renewable energy technologies and electrification is important for just transition, for mitigation in industry, and for achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement, right? So there are certainly also pressures because electrification is seen as the solution. And of course, I'm not saying this isn't one. It is definitely a solution for mitigating emissions. But of course, the way in which it is conducted matters. And that's why we are advocating in these spaces to make sure that these actions, just transition actions, do not violate indigenous people's rights. And so, of course, a lot of the narrative has been driven by parties and industry, and mainly focuses on scaling up renewable energy, including wind, solar, energy storage, and related infrastructure as the solution. So as you pointed out, these technologies are extremely mineral intensive. And what's another important thing to say also is minerals are extremely localized. If we think that oil is localized, because it is localized in some countries, minerals is even more localized. So we're talking about cobalt, right? 70% of the cobalt comes from the DRC. If we talk about lithium, around 50% of the output comes from Chile and Argentina. So of course, they are extremely localized minerals, right? And so why does this matter? It matters because it changes the dynamics. The narrative matters because it changes the dynamics. Why? Because if we are facing, climate catastrophe, if we are facing energy insecurity, then indigenous peoples' rights become ethical considerations in this narrative, or they become impacts that can be mitigated and should be balanced against broader economic objectives of countries. So that's why it is important. And this, we feel it also in my own country, in Guatemala. We've seen how the price of nickel, for example, over the past few months has increased by $5,000 per ton. And which means that it's more economically feasible, for even when there are doubts about whether consent has been obtained, even if there is reputational risk, if there is legal risk to a project, the price, of course, of that the market sets has implications on whether these projects go ahead or not. So this is the case, for example, in Guatemala. We have a mine that's extracting nickel. It's called the Phoenix Nickel Mine. And mind you, this mine had their license revoked a few years ago, and now they have a new owner, and are restarting the project one more time, which I think emphasizes the need that this is a global phenomenon, and that decisions that are made elsewhere, in places such as in Bonn, in places such as in Belém, have an impact on indigenous peoples' lands. And so that's the connection, and that's why we're here. And I would just like to emphasize then, before I move on from this point, is that if mining for climate action and for energy security is happening without free, prior, and informed consent, then that's not justice, that's not climate action, that's not energy security, that's violence, and that's colonization. And that's why we keep saying here in Bonn, right, that this is not justice, and we have a right to oppose it. And that's why we are activated and advocating in these spaces, that the just transition mechanism, in fact, delivers tangible benefits for communities. If the just transition mechanism, where we see is the most natural place to operationalize paragraph 12I, who my colleague Joan Carling rightly so elevated because it's so groundbreaking, we see the just transition mechanism as the space to operationalize 12I. And if it does not deliver tangible solutions, then it will mean little for indigenous peoples.
Mm. And what are indigenous peoples asking to this mechanism to perform, Bryan? I mean, there is a set of requests that are being discussed. How are those conversations going? What are the concrete asks? Maybe you can share that with our audience.
Of course. So, of course, we've been developing collectively the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, and the group of on just transition has been developing a set of recommendations for parties, so that they take into consideration and operationalize 12I and paragraph 18. So paragraph 18 is also a very important paragraph because it recognizes the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as tools that can guide just transitions, right? And so what we are asking as a constituency is that the mechanism, through its functions, because the mechanism will have functions, right? It will have an institutional arrangement. Hopefully, that's what what parties are negotiating right now. It will have outputs as well, and modalities, and so that we are able to include the implementation of 12I and 18 as a cross-cutting element. But it's important that it's not only a cross-cutting element because it leaves it at a principle level, but that we go into the operative details also of the mechanism. So, for example, one important part for us is policy guidance, because the mechanism can support parties in implementing national just transition strategies within their own countries, because we have to say, right, just transition is going to happen at a national level. Yes, there are global events that impact transition minerals, that impact Indigenous peoples' lands, but just transition is going to happen at a national level. So how is this implemented at a national level matters, right? There are tools within the UNFCCC, so the national determined contributions, the national adaptation plans, and other tools where we have to secure implementation of paragraph 12I as part of the just transition strategies that countries are putting forth. And that's why we are advocating in the negotiations that those important functions stay there. There is also a need for monitoring and assessment, right? There will have to be some monitoring and assessment about how countries are incorporating elements or incorporating paragraph 12I and paragraph 18. Now, at the same time, why do I keep emphasizing that this is at a national level? Because, of course, the just transition, as it is understood within the UNFCCC system, right, is nationally determined. So, yes, we can make recommendations. We can make submissions. We can participate in the negotiations. But at the end of the day, these are voluntary. And countries have to adopt it and incorporate it. They have to have a will to actually do this. And so we have to move forward if we are able and successful to include those elements in the negotiation of the mechanism, of the functions of the mechanism, and also continue our advocacy at the national level. Importantly, also, we are asking for institutionalized participation of Indigenous peoples. One of the main points of convergence at this moment is whether there should be a constituted body with a political arm, with a technical arm, or whether there should be only a coordination body or a network, right? Of course, we want to see a constituted body that secures seats for Indigenous peoples within that constituted body, so that Indigenous peoples can participate and bring those topics to the table. And because we also have expertise, a technical question is, how are we going to implement free, prior, and informed consent within those national just transition strategies? So it's an important question. And of course, we could talk at length about the outputs, the modalities, the mechanism, right? But I don't want to take all the time. So I will just leave it there. And we'll be sharing as well the positions from Indigenous peoples on how the mechanism should be operationalized, which I will say it doesn't diverge so much from what many countries are saying. But of course, there are a few countries that don't hold the same views, and it's a party-driven process. So we have to wait and see and allow for the debate to happen from the floor.
Bryan, just a clarification question, because we have talked extensively about paragraph 12I, but maybe not mention paragraph 18. Could you just give us a highlight so the audience is very clear about how do they complement each other?
Yes, that's really important, because So paragraph 12I again is groundbreaking. It recognizes our rights, self-determination, free, prior, and informed consent, and Indigenous peoples' involuntary isolation, initial contact. That's wonderful. But paragraph 18, it's a complement, and a very important complement, because paragraph 18 basically collects all of those tools, all of those processes that can guide just transition. And we were successful in including this at the COP30, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So my colleague Joan was talking about grievance mechanisms, right? That is a fundamental, it's a basic element, right, of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So that's why we can come into this space and, of course, ask for implementation, right? But of course, there are parties, especially to this day, that are still making statements from the floor and asking that these important elements not be considered as through the implementation of the just transition mechanism, which underpins why we need to be really activated to ensure that 12I and 18, because they now establish a very important normative way through which governments and businesses should conduct their just transition, is implemented and delivers, again, tangible benefits for Indigenous communities on the ground.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you for that, Bryan, because that ties to what Joanne was speaking about earlier, right? The work that is being done with these all additional spaces to ensure that those rights are respected. And what you just said, know how to get that to the ground, to the national level, right? Because these are recommendations and then they need to be implemented. And that's, that's where the question is always is on the implementation. I just want now to see if we can also remember as a group, as an audience, is that all these agreements are reached on consensus. And that's why the negotiations take so long. And that's why sometimes the results are not what maybe most of us expect or most of the countries participating expect, because there is a lot of negotiation and one country, one single government can really push back and keep a language out. So Bryan, thank you very much for that. Let's move on. We'll come back to you with some more questions from the audience and also for the group. But let's move now to Emmanuel Umpula Nkumba from AfriWatch. He is going to help us understand a little bit more about what is happening in DRC with the mining in the Copperbelt. So let's see, Emmanuel, welcome to this group. If you can, please turn on your camera if you're able. Otherwise, if your internet is not stable. Yes, there you are, Emmanuel. Thank you very much. And then can I just ask? Yes, perfect. There you are.
Yeah, thank
Welcome,
you so much.
Emmanuel.
Yeah, thank you.
Emmanuel is the founder and executive director of AfriWatch, and he is based in DRC, Congo. He has spent more than 20 years on mining governance and community rights in the DRC Copperbelt. So let's see, Emmanuel, tell us a little bit about how is the DRC, for example, validating the strategy for green industrialization, and which promises of local processing are staying within the country? What is the distance? Basically, what I'm trying to understand is what is the distance between those promises and what communities in the Copperbelt are living day to day? What is the reality in DRC?
Yes, thank you so much. So I will start by giving you a bit of context so you understand what will come next. So my name is Emmanuel Umpula. I work for both AfriWatch DRC and AfriWatch International. And coming back to question of Copperbelt, let's say Congo own a lot of critical minerals, copper, cobalt, lithium, zinc, and today I can say the production is very high. Example, Congo is producing in terms of copper more than 3 million tons of copper, more than...
Sorry, Emmanuel. Emmanuel, apologies for interrupting you. Our audience is asking you to speak a little bit louder so they can hear you. Okay, so
Okay, no problem.
just a little bit louder. Thank you so much.
So
apologies.
Congo is producing around 3 million, more than 3 million tons of copper, more than 250,000 tons of cobalt, and is this 2026 Congo will produce more than 2,200 and 4,000 ton of zinc, and soon Congo will produce lithium in Manono province, and Congo has a big deposit of lithium, and as soon as Congo will start producing lithium, it will be one of the world's biggest producers of lithium. So it's coming soon, and so what happened is, two started in 2000. We used to produce, and then the production went down, and we restarted in 2000 and let's say 2002, where Congo put in place a new Congolese mining law. So I think the question of let's say the question of value addition, it's a key. But what I can say is, when the mining was open to private companies, I think Congo didn't think about the adding value at the local level. So today, Congo is more exporting those minerals. Only copper, where we have metals, we have metals of copper producing locally, but cobalt is exported as a raw materials. And China today is refining, let's say, around 80% of Congo is cobalt. So it's refined in China. So we don't refine locally. That's so now Congo is trying to come back to that. We've seen a discussion between politicians trying to say we need to refine those minerals at local level. But this, it's a will. Congo is trying. So from the will to the materialization or the implementation, so there is a gap between that. And there is many reasons for that. One is lack of technology. So we don't own technology. So if we need to implement, to refine locally, so we need to own technology. That's what we don't own. The second challenge is most of the time they say energy. I know energy, it's one of the points mining companies are saying, oh, we don't have enough energy, so we can't refine locally, so we need to shift those minerals out of the country where there's a lot of more energy. So that's another challenge Congo need to meet to have energy. The second one, you need to build the whole ecosystem, because those minerals, you can't, I'm not an expert, but what people usually say, you can't, case of cobalt, if you add value at local level, let's say in Congo, and then the place where you need to produce those batteries will be around. So you can't shift those materials from Congo to China, for instance. So you need to have the whole ecosystem where if you refine locally, then you need to know buyers will be around, so you can use them. So that's another challenge. People are saying if Congo need to refine, we need to have that. The other challenge is finance. Congo need to fund this idea of having adding value at local level. So no one will come and say, we are going to do it for you. So it means the DRC needs to have money, the finance to fund its own vision. So you have that lack of fund. So we have been discussing, or Minister of Mine and all parties have been discussing, but no one is saying that is going to put the money on the table to develop this strategy. And there is a will, because we have like what we call Congolese Center of Batteries. But this is an idea, as I was saying. So we need money to push forward this idea. And sorry?
I was muted, sir. What's the gap then between those ideas and what is happening with the communities in the Copperbelt?
Yes. So that's the idea. So what is happening is like, let's say, question of consultation. This is a huge problem. And you know, when we talk about this, the FPIC, most of the time, is not applied. The reason is because people who are living around mining, they are not considering them like indigenous people. They consider them like a local community or local communities. So that's a huge gap, because they said no, you can't include all of them like indigenous people. So we consider, not me, but Minister of Mine and companies, that's the way they consider those communities. That's one problem. So they are not well consulted. And
so no FPIC process, no FPIC, right?
FPIC process. No
FPIC process.
Yes.
No consultation processes.
Including the place where, for instance, the case of Manono, where there is indigenous people, they are not applying this FPIC. And we've trying to push for the implementation of it. But you know, when politicians, because this licensing process is not transparent, it's not clear. So those people, they are not participating, including even us as NGOs. We can see just the rights is already, or the license is already granted to the company without any clear process, or without any clear participation or consultation. So that's first problems. The second problems is pollutions around. We've just published 4 reports last week.
Pollution, right?
Yeah, on pollutions. Water pollution, air pollution, and soil pollutions. So you can go on our website, you can see how pollutions is a main problems for around those mining. That's another problems. And this prevents communities is destroying this pollution, the land, you see? So people will not grow food, so because of these pollutions. And if you go around those mining areas, you will find that people are starving. They are starving because they can't grow food. Why they can't grow food? Because of pollutions. And the state doesn't use its power to stop that or to mitigate the situation. That are another problems communities are facing around, community living around this mining are facing. The other problem is benefit distribution. Let's say this is there is improvement. If we take the Congolese 2002 mining code and the 2018 mining code, which was it's a revision of the mining code. I think for this there is a, let's say, the improvement, because there is some money which have been paid to communities or to local authorities. And then you have another huge problems of management at that level, because the state is trying to get all this money back. Because so that's another problem of management, because the state is using its power to get this money back. And the other thing we can say, when people are coming to mine in these regions, they are not coming with the vision of staying. It's just they are rushing to take those minerals in a quick way. After that, they can leave. So the investment in terms of social development, it's low. It's low. And how can someone who doesn't live in the region can build a good school for people? How can someone who is kids do not live in the region can do a good hospital or where he can go himself? So that's other problems communities living in this region are facing. So if you are there, you see that the production is very higher, but the poverty is also higher on the other side. So you don't understand. Yeah. And to end, the other thing we have, when you mine, you don't, in terms of profits, you make a lot of profits when you go down. So the other question is how you share profits with all EV companies, because they are making a lot of money. Most of the time they are saying that they are not in Congo, they are not in Africa, but they are getting a lot of money through minerals coming from Congo because they are getting this money through their supply chains. Yeah. So this is another issue we need to put on table to discuss how we make sure that this money coming from because if you discuss with companies, mining companies, they will say, yes, we are making money, but if you go downstream, those companies, they are making a lot of money than us. So this is another question. And that's the question of localization, adding value at local level. But yes, let's say that those are some issues we have, all communities are facing, living around those mining are facing.
Exactly. So we have to look at those communities basically whole customary tenure rather than recognize indigenous status, so they don't have the same mechanisms to support them. And at the same time, they're part of a long supply chain that is not regulated and not supported to protect their rights or their health or their safety. I have more questions for you, Emmanuel, but we're going to move on to our next speaker and then we'll go back to you. So we allow time for questions from the audience that are eager to also talk to you. So let's move from the Copperbelt to Bolivia and meet Carlos Mamani Condori, who works from a very different kind of a space. I mean, Carlos is Aymara, historian, a community organizer, and he is looking at something that I find quite interesting and curious, and I hope this audience also finds it interesting and curious. And he's working with land titles issued by the Spanish Crown in 1590 to assert Aymara territory ownership over land now target for lithium. So I'm going to invite Carlos hi Carlos, nice to see you there, and I'm glad you are online and your internet is working well. I would love to hear a little bit about your work with land titles issued by the Spanish Crown, because I know that you are working with these documents as a way to protect indigenous rights over their territories and as a step to protect these communities from the extraction of minerals in their territories. So, Carlos, over to you. Please tell us a little bit about how you're working with these documents. Why are you doing it? How are you doing it? And just to clarify that this is not only Bolivia, Carlos is also going to talk a bit about Argentina and the wider Andes region.
Thank you very much, Paula. I also want to greet my co-speakers with whom I am working. My work with land titles has been happening for a long time, but it's also a recent kind of work because there has been very much interest in the lithium triangle. It is located in the Andes Mountains and it affects the Coria peoples who live in Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. And we also have a department in Macusari, which has rock lithium versus the presence of lithium in salt plains. So I'm interested in this topic of lithium extraction, because no community has been consulted, neither the state, neither the companies have received previous free and informed consent. And communities are perceived to be as lacking rights and lacking the capacity to negotiate with state or companies regarding the benefits that could result from lithium extraction, let alone regarding the damages to the environment. So, for the last 8 or so months, I've been going back to the colonial titlings, the crown titlings, and I was quite surprised to see that both in Argentina as well as in Bolivia, when it comes to exploiting the salt plains, the Spanish crown started giving land titles starting on the year 1591. And when the Spanish came, they started to usurp territories from indigenous people, uninhabited territories were taken, but if there was indigenous peoples there, they offered titling. The crown perceived this to be as messy, so they had to reorganize this situation. So starting from the year 1591, I believe this happened in the Americas, but also in Filipinas, as it defended from the royal territory of New Spain. They started expediting the land titling, and what we see in the picture are ancestral authorities in Bolivia that carry within their textile production the crown's titlings. So it is quite interesting, especially in Bolivia, the defense of territories based on the land titlings offered by the Crown of Spain. The land titles are very important because it determines the size of indigenous territories. It also establishes the borders. And they also give the titling of possession. So, for example, when it came to the Spaniards taking rule of a territory, they could uproot some plants and they would throw some stones, and that's what the colonial authorities would do. But the Spanish colonists would abuse this system. So once, over and over again, starting in 1591, indigenous peoples had to purchase and repurchase their own lands to remain free. And in the Republican times, this continued, and up until today, there are colonial titles that are preserved by certain authorities. However, when it comes to the titling itself, when they are very antique, they must be deciphered and they are not taken into account by authorities. Or in the case of Bolivia, it is said that the state has the prevailing rights, and anything that is related to mineral and that is underneath the soil does belong to the state. So that makes it more difficult for the indigenous people to exercise their rights. Here we have some ancestral rights, and up until now we have a kind of a dance in the south of Peru as well as in some areas of Bolivia, together with Quito, and in the Pasto department in the Pasto department, where they call it Ayauma. So this art is the kind of art that we find in the Salt Plains region. And I wanted to show this to you because in the year 1974, the first Indigenous Parliament of America took place in San Bernardino, Paraguay. And in its final declaration, the parties acknowledged that titled or with no titled, the land belonged to us because we are ancestral peoples. And that is important because the UN declaration, as well as the Bolivia constitution, acknowledge indigenous people as pre-existent people. And there may be some peoples that do not have this written titles from the ground, but art such as this one acknowledges the ownership of the territories to the indigenous owners. In Spanish tradition, having to do with the commitments that Spain had with the papacy of Rome, they committed to maintaining the indigenous population, and that would require to have the colonial titling. This is an image of art in the border between Bolivia and Argentina. Here's where we can see El Inca, and it shows the relationship between the Incan state and its territories. Everything that belongs to the Lithium Triangle was part of the Incan Empire, and that shows how the state signed off for a territory of La Quiaca. So going back to the colonial land title. In the 19th century process, when the republics carried out, we had a second wave of colonization in the whole region. And the goal is to end with indigenous populations, and in order to do so, we had to remove the land rights. Normally, these land titlings are stolen, they are confiscated, and therefore the communities do not have the way to defend their access to the land and territory. I sent you a copy of this document that shows the royal stamp. It shows the name of the king, and when they are original, they have the wax royal seal. And what you can see is the authentication with the wax seal that makes it original and legally binding. So some of them have been partly preserved by communities, but mostly they have been preserved in the colonial archives that were present in all capitals. We would have the National Archive of Bolivia in Sucre, as well as one in Charcas. We have another archive in Lima, and the same goes for Argentina. And in the case of Filipinas, there was a royal audience of Filipinas, but due to historical reasons and due to the invasion of the Japanese in Second World War, these archives have been lost. But the documents that have to do with Philippines can be checked in the archives of Mexico, as well as the royal in these archives as well. It is quite difficult to find these land titles because when we go to the catalogs, we may not see the royal grant for this specific land title for that community. We can see them as purchase, we can see them as transfer. It's like looking for a needle in a straw in a haystack, looking for a needle in a haystack. And this is the royal stamp that we would find in all the archives that have all the archives corresponding to the countries that have suffered from Spanish colonialism. So in the 19th and 20th century, we come to the Republican colonialism. And why are they important? Well, because the Republic, the state, argues that the minerals that are present in the soil are belonging to the state. That's what the law says. But when the Crown of Spain sold the territories, which were sold in gold and silver, as is acknowledged in the titling, in the case of the Lithium Triangle, it was including the salt plains. So that's when we see the documents regarding Santiago de Ococo, La Palma, and Corona in the south of Potosí, that were the owners of half of the salt plains. And the Maicus spiritual leaders carry out the possession rituals in the salt plains. And there are also other cases in which the communities have presence in their communities. And I'll finish with this. Up until a little while ago, the exploitation of the salt plains was in the hands of the communities. Their economies depended on the exploitation of the salt plains.
Thank you very much for that. It is an incredible journey, the one that you are on, investigating and trying to find these titles, land titles for the communities. I have more questions for you, but we are, as usual, running out of time in these webinars. So I'm going to go back to Joan to talk about Asia, and then we will have one round of questions with all the panelists. And I can see in the chat that many of the questions coming from the audience have been answered. So we will have maybe a little bit of time to talk a bit more time with all the panelists. Let's see if we can make a bit of magic and stretch that. So Joan, welcome back. Welcome back now to talk a little bit about Asia and about what is happening in the ground, right?
Yeah. Okay. As you know, nickel, which is a critical mineral, is found in Indonesia and the Philippines. The number one source is Indonesia, and second, the Philippines. And if we look at what's happening on the ground, like for example, in North Maluku, where the Ohanga Manyawa indigenous peoples face severe threats from nickel mining. And Indonesia's nickel industry is central to the global electric vehicle supply chain. As we know, it's needed for the e-batteries. But this green mineral economy is destroying forests and rivers and indigenous territories. For example, in Halmahera alone, there are at least 29 mining permits covering more than 186,000 hectares, of which overlap with indigenous territories. Forest destruction and river pollution have reduced the living space of the Manyawa, including those living in voluntary isolation. Remember, in the agreement, people with involuntary isolation should be protected, but that is not the case in Indonesia, as we can see from this example. And they are being displaced. So the worst thing is that criminalization has also followed community resistance. So 6 leaders were prosecuted after defending their lands for ancestral forest against mining expansion. 4 of them were sentenced to life imprisonment, while 2 others were sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment. So we can see from this case the intensification of the criminalization of indigenous peoples, which also reflects the broader reality where protecting forest is treated as a crime, even as mining companies operate with state support, as in this case of the community in Halmahera. The nickel boom is not causing development or not advancing development for the people. No, in fact, it is threatening their very survival. And that is what we really see on the ground. Aside from the destruction of forest, it also brings criminalization, food insecurity, pollution of rivers, and destruction of medicinal plants, and weakening entire cultural identity. So that is the case of Indonesia. In the Philippines, which is, I mentioned, the second largest producer of nickel, the rapid expansion of nickel mining which is driven largely by the demand for electric batteries. It has increasingly affected indigenous people's ancestral domain, particularly in Palawan, Zambales, Surigao, and Zamboanga. It shows that mining activities in Palawan and Caraga region have flawed processes of obtaining FPIC, a common practice that FPIC is manipulated, and that there are allegations of coercion, bribery, exclusion of genuine indigenous leaders, and others. Mining activities have resulted to massive deforestation, river and coastal siltation, negatively impacting forest-dependent livelihoods, agriculture, and fisheries. So it's very similar to what is also happening in Indonesia with nickel mining. So in Zambales, nickel mining has resulted to environment, health, and economic degradation, including heavy metal contamination, respiratory and skin diseases, reduced access to clean water, and loss of agricultural productivity. In Zamboanga, the Subanan indigenous communities have repeatedly opposed mining activities affecting their ancestral lands and citing threats to sacred sites, watersheds, and customary governance systems. So this, again, is another example of this kind of projects threatening sacred sites. And there is no way you can mitigate the destruction of sacred sites, right? So overall, this issue of securing critical minerals in the name of decarbonation is reproducing historical patterns of dispossession and the systematic violations of indigenous people's rights, and even increasing criminalization. So that's also the reason why IPRI, my organization, is very much looking into this issue, because it has really there's really an increase of attacks and criminalization directly related to the just transition. And this is what's happening all over, as we also heard from DRC and from Bolivia.
Exactly. It's a common problem across all territories and all over the world. And with that, Joan, let's bring all the panelists now into this space, and let's have the 4 of you here. So if I can invite Emmanuel, Bryan, and Carlos, please to open your cameras and join Joan and me in this space. I will have maybe a question or two for all of you together, and you can take a little bit of turns answering them. And I think we still have a few questions from the audience that address that are directed to you, and they have not been answered yet. But let's start with one question. Philippa, I see you raising your hand. Do you want to go now or after we ask the question?
Well, just to say, Paula, I think one of the questions in the chat is about the legal mechanisms to enforce some of the things that you've talked about today, whether that's the just transition mechanism and other UN-based and other international mechanisms. If they're not legally binding, or if we don't have the mechanisms to enforce them, how do we take action? So a few people have asked questions along those lines.
Let's start there. Let's start there because it's a common question and it's something that has surfaced during this conversation, right? What do we do if the mechanism and all that these are all recommendations? How do we make this legally binding? So please go ahead. I don't know if Bryan or Joan or Emmanuel would like to answer that first.
Maybe the others, because I just spoke.
Yeah,
Bryan,
I can address.
yes, please.
Yes, of course. So when talking about the legal mechanisms, right, I would just like to clarify first that the just transition mechanism will not be a regulatory body, right? It is not built in that way to be a regulatory body. It can become a space where we can advocate and bring those issues to the forefront, a loudspeaker of sorts, where we continue our advocacy and bring forward the challenges and risks posed by the extraction of minerals, right? We heard from Emmanuel about copper. And when we talk about copper, the latest numbers show that over the next 20 years, humanity is going to need to mine the same amount that we've mined in all of our history, about 700 million metric tons of copper. So what does that mean for our ecosystems, for indigenous peoples? These are also minerals that are located in the lands of indigenous peoples. So of course, this is something that has to worry us, but the mechanism, it's a mechanism to provide guidance, right? To provide maybe monitoring and assessment on how indigenous peoples' rights are implemented into national just transition policies and strategies, right? Now, of course, on how we continue the fight for protecting indigenous peoples' rights, it has to be at the national level, and that's why we need case law, right? We need the codification of free, prior, and informed consent into national laws to ensure that free, prior, and informed consent is, in fact, an operative mechanism, and where there's not just consultation, or there isn't just a process that doesn't ultimately lead to indigenous peoples deciding whether to allow or not to allow development to happen in their land. And we have to fight back because of course there are lots of things that happen that of course impede indigenous peoples from exercising that right. But it is an indigenous people's right. It is not up for governments or for companies to define what that looks like for us. We have to build our own protocols and take it to and make sure that it is codified. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan. I don't know if Emmanuel or Joan would like to add something to that.
Yeah, I can add something. Yeah, I mean, myself, I've been advocating on the international level, at the UN level, trying to get guidance and everything at that level. But you know, I can take the example of UN. UN. What the name? I can't remember the name, but I remember we advocate for that, and then we get something in terms of consultation, and yeah. But the question is, when you are working at that level and you are far away to communities, and also the question of implementation on national level, it's still a problem. So I think the good thing is how you integrate in the national law. That's those principles you can get at the international level become, you can enforce them, you can implement them. So, and we did in the case of DRC, where we introduced the right of consultation in the mining code. But also from that, even if you have that in the local mining code or national mining code, then there is a question of implementation come. And that leads to make sure that judge or magistrates, they understand the law. So as AfriWatch, for instance, what we are doing, we put in place an ecosystem where we work with universities to get evidences. We work with lawyers. So we create law firms where we can support them, we work together with them because they need to understand. And then we have a school where we train magistrates, we train lawyers, we train, because alone, we need to put in place an ecosystem where people will understand those mechanisms. It can be at the national and international level, but then we need to make sure that people understand them at national level. And especially people who need to enforce them. So they need to understand, because, you know, it's a question of money. And sometimes lawyers and magistrates, they don't think it's mining law, it's part of let's say the judicial system, because they know that there is a lot of interests coming, there is politician involved in this area. So we need to push them to say mining law, it's a law like others you are implementing. So you need to be part. If you need to support those communities living around, then magistrates and lawyers need to be involved.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emmanuel. So we have 2 minutes left, and there is so much we could continue talking about this, because this is a topic, obviously, we all feel very, very engaged with. I have one question that I would like you to consider it within the frames. Many people here work in policy, many people in the audience work in policy, advocacy, funding. They're all committed to this cause. So what can they do between now and COP31 to help close the gap? And let's move a little bit apart from the legal mechanisms. I'm mixing a little bit my question with Mauricio's question. Apart from legal mechanisms, so what is the scope for global consumers awareness and pressure campaigns? So, you know, what is the space for global consumers awareness and pressure campaigns? And what can people working in this sector who are today in this space actually do between now and COP31 to help close the gap we've been discussing? So let's go over to you, Joan. Very quick and very brief, because we have 1 minute.
First and foremost is to support the communities in defending their territories in the way they need support. And second is to make the consumer of these products aware that the e-batteries, for example, are produced with the hands, with the blood of indigenous people. So there should be an awareness also in addressing the supply chain, right? That is leading to systemic violations of indigenous people. So consumers should be made aware that they should not buy products or even support this kind of demand that is causing more inequality, but also not addressing really climate change. In fact, it's not an effective solution to climate change. And I think that should be a clear narrative. And to change the narrative that we are the ones obstructing this, when we are the ones, in fact, protecting what's left of the world for effective climate change. So I think that putting indigenous peoples as providing the effective solution to climate change, instead of becoming victims of this business as usual approach, including the just transition, is not going to solve our problem. So we need solidarity and support to frontline defenders of communities. We need policy change. We need implementation of the agreement, especially land tenure, free, prior, and informed consent, and demand. We need public to demand governments and companies to do this, that it should be not commitment in words, but in action, in policy, in clear implementation and practice.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you. Bryan, what can you add to that?
Yes, I can only add that there is not one solution that will address all these issues. There's no silver bullet approach. We have to use all the tools available in our toolkit. And that includes, of course, unleashing the power of a well-informed consumer. And that, of course, includes as well bringing corporate accountability to the forefront, right? Because there has never been any time in history where companies have been this vulnerable to scrutiny from the public. And we have to use it. We have to use this platform, this momentum that we have, to ensure that people understand that if transition minerals are being extracted without FPIC, then that's not justice. And Indigenous peoples' rights are not ethical considerations. They are not impacts that can be mitigated, but it has to underpin a central part of the transition is respecting Indigenous peoples' rights, and the mechanism has to do that also, right? Bring tangible benefits for communities.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. And then I'm going to ask Carlos as well with your final words. I don't know if, Carlos, you can hear us. Your camera is still off. But Emmanuel,
Yeah.
what could you add to
Thank you
that?
so much. I can say I agree with Bryan. I think we don't have a unique mechanism we can use. We need to make sure that we can try all of them. It depends on each case. It can be on if you can get solution at local level, it's good. National level, it's good. And if you are not satisfied with that, then you can aim to go at the international level. And then you can choose. There is a lot of means you can use at the UN, at OCD, you can use, but also you can try to use a national justice, for instance, for some cases. We tried to use in the past, but to end my word, I would recommend to use national level mechanism. We need to make sure that those principles at international level, they are integrated in national level, and that will give NGOs more power to request justice for communities living around those mining.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Carlos. I don't think you can hear us, so I'm just going to start closing this webinar because we are 3 minutes over the hour, and or maybe you can, Carlos? Yes, there you are. Hola. Carlos, any final words? Any recommendations to the audience? Go ahead.
Yes, for example, the work I'm doing so that the FPIC is really effective, so that there's a free, prior and informed consent. The most powerful instrument, for example, are the titles when it comes to former Spanish colonies. Because the Crown recognized territorial rights. And for example, when we look at the Bolivian state at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, there has been a recognition of these titles. No one can go into these territories without permits, and no one can exploit their resources with express consent from indigenous peoples. This is a really effective mechanism and instrument. So the brothers and sisters that attend to the negotiations at COP, etc., as Emmanuel said, they need to take into account those instruments that the colonial stance and then the national stance already recognized.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much, Carlos. So we covered a lot of ground today, and don't worry if you miss something, you will all receive the webinar recording. We also produce multilingual materials. There is a podcast that comes out of this webinar. And if you're still with us and you haven't left the room, please fill out this short survey that my colleague Felipe has put in the link. It really helps us shape the content of these webinars. Our next webinar coming up is on July the 30th. The registration link is also in the chat. And we just have to say thank you to our 4 panelists, Joan, Bryan, Emmanuel, Carlos, to my colleague Filipa, to the amazing team at TINTA supporting us through the session, and to all of you for staying with us. So thank you very much for this afternoon together, morning or evening, depending where you are in the world. And we hope to see you in our next webinar on July the 30th. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.